part of our Women's History Month events. So today we will be having Harriet Washington speak on the manifestations of anti-Blackness in health professions. Before we jump into that, I have a couple housekeeping items, and then we will get going with the rest of the program. So first thing is just a quick content warning. Some of the knowledge and information that's going to be shared today might be triggering for you. If you are triggered by things that are brought up today, please feel free to direct message Shatina Hunter. She's a member of our counseling center staff. She's waving at you right now. She has her DMs on, so feel free to direct message her during this session at any time, and she will gladly connect with you. If you feel once you leave here that you would like to connect with somebody, I'm just going to go ahead and drop in the counseling center's website into the chat. So please feel free to copy and paste that, save that to a Google Doc or whatever. And that way, if you need to connect with someone following this session, you have it at your fingertips, okay? One other thing for housekeeping, our next keynote in honor of LGBTQ plus Awareness Month will be taking place on Thursday, April 8th, and that will be featuring Scott Turner Schofield. So if you want to register for that, please visit the DISC website, click on Cultural Awareness Months, and then you'll find a big red registration button right in the middle of the page. Click on that and it will walk you through the process. So today's keynote will be moderated by Drs. Alicia Swartz and Claire Valderrama Wallace, who are both assistant professors in the CSU East Bay Department of Nursing and co-chairs of the Dismantling Racism in Nursing Education Task Force. Prior to them introducing Harriet Washington, I just want to ask that folks please hold all of your questions until the end when Claire and Alicia ask for them. And what they would like for you to do is just please direct message either Claire or Alicia your question, and they will ask it of Harriet. Feel free to use the chat if you want to interact with the folks who are here, but hold questions until they're asked for and direct message Alicia and Claire. And with that, I will pass the mic to our moderators today, and feel free to take it away.
Thank you so much, Jess. Thank you all for joining us for today's session with Harriet Washington. It is my absolute pleasure. I'm Dr. Alicia Swartz, by the way. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Harriet Washington today. Harriet Washington is a prolific scientific writer, editor, and ethicist who is the author of the seminal book, Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Experimentation from Colonial Times to the Present, which won a National Book Critics Circle Award, a PEN Oakland Award, and the American Library Association Black Caucus Nonfiction Award. She is also the author of 5 other well-received books, including A Terrible Thing to Waste, Environmental Racism and Its Assault on the American Mind, as well as Carte Blanche, The Erosion of Informed Consent in Medical Research, which was just recently published last month by Columbia Global Reports. Washington is a writing fellow in bioethics at the Harvard Medical School, a fellow of the New York Academy of Medicine, and has been the 2015 to 2016 Miriam Shearing Fellow at the University of Nevada's Black Mountain Institute. She has also been a research fellow in medical ethics at Harvard Medical School, a visiting fellow at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, a visiting scholar of DePaul University College of Law, and a senior researcher scholar at the National Center of Bioethics at Tuskegee University. She has held fellowships at Stanford University and teaches bioethics at Columbia University, where she recently delivered the 2020 commencement speech to Columbia University's public health graduates. During that time, she also won Columbia's 2020 Mailman School of Public Health, the Public Health Leadership Award, and as well as the 2020 to 2021 Kenneth and Mimi Clark Distinguished Lecture Award. Washington has written widely for popular publications and has been published and referenced in books and journals such as Nature, JAMA, the American Journal of Public Health, the New England Journal of Medicine, the Harvard Public Health Review, ICES, the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics. She has been an editor of the Harvard Journal of Minority Public Health, a guest editor of the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics, and has served as a reviewer for the Journal of American Association of Bioethics and Humanities. And we are just so thrilled that she has joined us here today. We're so happy to have you, Harriet. And I'm also going to invite now to join me as a part of this conversation introducing Harriet, Dr. Claire Valdewama Wallace. Dr. Valdewama Wallace and I will be facilitating a conversation with Harriet this afternoon. So I would like to invite Claire to go on ahead and take the stage, and you can get us started with our conversation.
Thanks, Alicia. And again, special thanks to you, Harriet, for joining us. So I'll start off with our first question. So Medical Apartheid was published in 2007, and in it you chronicle centuries of unethical, violent, anti-Black practices and policies. And throughout all these years, you visited multiple campuses and various communities. And I'm wondering, what have folks been most impacted by or hungry to talk about and understand when you have shared and being in community with so many different audiences?
You want to go on ahead and unmute yourself.
Can you all hear me now? First of all, thank you for having me here. I'm very excited about our conversation. And you know, the communities I've spoken to fall into two camps. I mean, I'm often talking to people from medical schools and undergraduates, or people from the communities impacted most by the history that I've detailed. But I also speak to a lot of medical ethicist community, and both here in the US and abroad in Europe, primarily. And they have different but allied interests. People who live in the communities for whom research subjects are drawn, laypersons, they are shocked by the history, but not really. What's interesting to me is that I often am, regaled by people who have their own tales of abuse. You know, a grandparent, an ancestor, a mother, an aunt who was abused in the medical system. And they often express an understanding that though they didn't know the details, they knew this history existed because it's an oral history passed on from generation to generation. When I speak with people who are from the academic community, either here or in the other countries, they are typically completely shocked. They claim to have no inkling that a lot of this transpired and don't report any generational experience with it. And that's very telling because the title of the book reflects my belief that if you look at the health profiles and the experiences of Black and white Americans, it's like looking at people in two different countries. That's what apartheid means. So you're treating them like they're in two different countries and they have very different experiences. And that actually hobbles communication. It makes it more difficult to open up a dialogue when our experiences differ so much. It's like police brutality. Over the past 30 years, there's been a huge change. 30 years ago, there was police brutality, but nobody acknowledged it. You know, if an African American was accosted, abused, or even killed, the primary dialogue was, well, he must have done something, We had an editorial writer in a newspaper that I worked for. He wrote for the editorial pages, very erudite. He was confronted by police in front of the newspaper building. They put him in a police car. The police department was literally 1 block away, but I put him in a police car, took him to the police department. He had to call his lawyer. When he came back to the newsroom, everybody was saying they must have had some reason, for pulling you aside. But now things are different, of course. But the reason why I think so many whites, sounds obvious, but it's really not. The reason why there was so much reluctance to believe it on the part of whites was it did not mirror their experience. The same thing with medicine. I chronicled events that mirror the experiences today of African Americans, but not of white Americans. So discussing it is very difficult.
Yes, I agree. Sort of thinking about operating in different spaces and how those experiences are so different, creating its own form of apartheid. With that being said, sort of thinking about the role of media and the role that media plays in sort of bringing these issues to our own experience when they didn't necessarily happen to us or someone that we knew or someone we feel a fictitious kinship for. But now that we've witnessed it, watched it, and experienced it, I'm thinking about Emmett Till in the newspaper. I'm thinking about George Floyd. I'm thinking about the most recent physician that passed away that documented her experiences.
Dr. Susan Moore.
Yes, Dr. Susan Moore. I'm thinking about her and sort of bringing these things to the forefront via our media.
Right.
Can you speak to sort of the role that you think that plays in sort of calling out or bringing attention to issues around medical ethics?
I'm more aware than most people of newsroom culture because I spent a lot of time working in newsrooms. I was a newspaper editor for over 10 years, science editor at 2 newspapers, and then the page 1 editor at USA Today. So my perception before I began doing this work was that I expected there'd be difficulty because I would be not only dealing with journalists who had little experience with any culture outside of white culture, but also I'd be supervising them as an editor. It wasn't that common 20 years ago. But what I realized after I began doing was it's not just that these were white males. These were all white males from Kansas. They were profoundly out of touch of not only African American culture, but actually from urban culture. So there's a certain perspective that gets perpetuated by newsroom culture that through which the news is filtered. You know, I tell my students there's a lot of talk, appropriately so, about fake news, but frankly, that's a very crude approximation that's almost worthless. It's not a matter of fake news. It's a matter of news that has been carefully curated and yet is presented as being representative of the truth. It can't be representative of the truth. It's being filtered through the experiences of a narrow group of people who share a smaller culture. So what we read in the newspapers has already been filtered through layers of editing, including cultural editing, not just facts, but the interpretation of facts. And that makes it very hard for that reporting to be accurate. It's often profoundly inaccurate. In fact, I'm having some friction with a national magazine that I'm going to bring it to an end soon. But I wrote a piece for them over 2 months ago in which I questioned the characterization of African American behavior around clinical trials as being aversive. You know, the prominent narrative was that African Americans are afraid of clinical trials and research because of Tuskegee, and so they're not engaging in clinical trials. I wrote a piece with data showing that that simply was not true. This magazine doesn't want to publish it. And they kept asking me more and more tangential questions. And I know the game, so I knew they just didn't want to publish it. But finally, they asked me a question that tipped their hand. It was, are you saying the news media got it wrong? I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying, you know? So yeah, we have to be very careful because when you see, phrases like the paper of record, it's important to understand that you're not reading objective facts. Newspapers, objectivity is a goal rather than something that one can hope to achieve, especially consistently. And objectivity is very, very far from what you're reading in the newspapers. It's filtered through a culture. You can see that very easily if you look at a newspaper like Forward, which is very openly, intended to promulgate the worldview of a certain group of people. There's nothing wrong with that. Forward is open about its focus. So as a final call, the Black Muslim newspaper, they have a quote unquote slant, but they're very open about it. The problem with the New York Times and Washington Post is there's no such disclaimer. The paper of record for whom? A small group of people that typically does not include us.
Thank you for that, Harriet. And this actually brings us really smoothly to the next question I was going to ask. You've talked about and written about how these histories, which are ongoing, have really been omitted from the canon of medical education.
Yes.
So considering increasing attention, today to racism, to white supremacy and colonialism in institutions of higher ed, what have you noticed about how health professions education has responded to or changed since you wrote Medical Apartheid?
I think it's very fortunate that I studied literature in college. I took a degree in something called general science as well, but I studied literature. And I'm glad I did, because it has allowed me to look at the semantics of medical communication. And what we see in medical settings is a very subtle but powerful use of language to distort what's transpiring. Here's a good example. When you speak about abuses that have been visited on African Americans, for example, or Hispanic Americans, very often the response you get is, oh yes, it's terrible about these abuses of the past. Who says they're confined to the past? But that has become a very common rhetoric. It's simply inaccurate. They're not confined to the past. When you speak about the very often logical fear and wariness of African Americans and other groups of people because of their treatment in the medical system, you sometimes still hear terms passed around like paranoid, or fearful. Why the focus on African American psyche and behaviors if that's the problem? Because the problem is not African American behavior. The problem is an untrustworthy healthcare system. So language is very often, in fact, routinely used to distort the conversation. One of the more amusing things that I've run into is that I gave a lecture some time ago and I talked about medical experimentation. When I said the term, I could see faces in the audience reacting to medical experimentation. And then afterwards, I love when they mansplain these simple things to me, right? Like I studied medical ethics. I kind of get this. But, the guy says, use of that term is inflammatory. A better term would be clinical trial. So this wasn't a clinical trial. And medical ethics, medical experimentation is an accurate term. We don't like to use it because it invokes fear in people. Studies have shown that the term medical experimentation seems to people to convey more risk and danger than terms like medical research or clinical trials. And that's why researchers like to use them. They don't want to have a term that invokes that fear, but they are accurate. And in fact, academics use it all the time. They just don't use it when they're talking to lay people or writing things that lay people could say. So, it's important to understand the use of language, and it can be very subtle or it can be outrageously open. For example, in informed consent, which is a very specific type of eliciting consent, as you know, giving everyone all the known risks and everything that they need to know to make an intelligent decision about joining medical research. Well, informed consent is powerful and important, but we now have we have many species of consent now that have the name consent in it and yet have nothing to do with consent, informed or otherwise. Community consent, the practice of telling a community, we'll be doing this research in your community. We're not going to ask your permission. We're just going to put you in the study if we're able to. But we want to let you know about that. And you call that community consent. There's no consent involved, Presumed consent, which is, believe it or not, presuming that were you to ask somebody's consent, they would give it to you. So you're not going to bother to ask. Well, obviously there's no consent involved there too, but the term consent is there. So my point is that semantics is very powerful and is used very skillfully by people who wish to either occlude the fact that there's no consent involved, or by people who hope to, I don't want to say, I'm trying to avoid saying deceiving, although very often they are deceiving, who are trying to convince or persuade subjects that they're not facing any real risk, when indeed that they are. So these are things that we have to be very careful about.
Thank you. I just want to touch on a couple of things that you just mentioned just now, which sort of lead me to a question that I've had on my mind that I've wanted to ask you for a time. And that is sort of thinking about the interpretation of facts. thinking about the semantics of medical communication, and thinking about how objectivity is filtered through culture. So really, I'm interested in understanding more about the intersection of ethics, history, and race, and specifically in the context of health sciences research. So,
Right.
and thinking about how largely issues around medical ethics can be attributed to these historical ideas that there is inherited biological differences between racial categories, right? And we know that these ideas are not scientifically sound by any means, even by genetic means or by theoretical means. They're invalid. However, we know that medical research, health sciences research continues to misuse racial categories in their modeling for assigning racial categories as predictor variables, as identified risks for pathology. We know those things to not really make sense. So in your view, what has that misuse of race, the misinterpretation of what the categories of race are, how has that really played a role in sort of propagating some of these issues in medical ethics?
The interesting thing about race, aside from the fact that it's an American obsession, is that we speak of misusing race, but the truth is race is doing exactly what it was designed to do. So Dorothy Roberts wrote an excellent book called Fatal Invention, and those of you who might not have seen it yet, I heartily recommend it. It's important to understand that racism created race. Racism came first. Race was created by racism. It was a tool of subjugation. It was a very timely invention because around the time when scientists were specializing in animal husbandry and enslavement were both very important economically to the new colonial powers. They used the same tools to enshrine both. In this country, the 19th century School of American Ethology, the best scientists and doctors in the country, in some cases in the world, got together and determined and told us who African Americans were. When they did that, it was strictly predicated on biological dimorphism. The idea that using this idea of race, this invented idea of race, they told us that African Americans belonged to a different species than did white Americans, that African Americans had primitive neurological systems that didn't allow them to feel pain, anxiety, heart disease, madness, like white people did. That African Americans had diseases that only they suffered from, and immunity to disease that would kill or harm white Americans. African Americans, in short, were very different creatures than white Americans. A lot of these beliefs we might laugh at, right? Their idea that Black people had a disease that only they had that whites would never have. Black people, for example, were the only people who had pellagra, according to this theory. We know now it's a deficiency disease that was caused by the starvation during enslavement, but back then it's a disease that only Black people have. That only Black people had drapetomania, Hebetu, Disease Ethiopica, diseases that were characterized by refusing to work, destroying your master's tools, talking back to your master, heaven forbid, striking a white person. All these things were Black diseases. And what do these symptoms have in common? A lack of enthusiasm for slavery. So if you resisted enslavement, say you ran away, now you have drapetomania, a disease only Black people have, characterized by your perverse resistance to enslavement, and you're going to be punished severely as part of your quote unquote treatment. So all these beliefs sound laughable to us today. The idea that Black people don't feel pain, we all know better, right? No. Studies that are done at these particular tenets find that we still have evidence of belief of these. For example, 2016, University of Virginia did a study showing that half of its medical students thought that African Americans did not feel pain the way whites did, and a good percentage of practicing doctors. A lot of studies have shown this. And we still believe in quote unquote Black diseases. Sickle cell anemia. Many people think that only affects Black people. We know differently. I mean, the worst case of sickle cell anemia are found in places like Iran. And anybody whose ancestors grew up around the Anopheles mosquito is vulnerable to it because the heterozygous state confers a limited immunity to malaria. So if you live in certain areas, it's actually an advantage to be a carrier for sickle cell. But we think of it as a Black disease to the extent that Dr. James Bowman, the late professor of genetics at Chicago, told me that he had to tell the students that he taught, you know, they tended to assume if someone said they had sickle cell anemia, that they were Black. And he said, no, it's not just he saw a lot of Black people being diagnosed with sickle cell anemia when they really had related other diseases like thalassemia because it's racialized. So the bottom line is that we still believe in racialization of disease and we behave that way. Look what happened with coronavirus. You know, it's actually a classic example. Now, I wrote a piece for Nature. I wrote it in April, they published it in May, and I pointed out that environmental racism was a primary vulnerability for a coronavirus infection. But I was struck by the fact that when they sent me back the galleys, I could see the other pieces they were running. Other pieces around coronavirus were focusing on biological dimorphism. A tiny, okay, I'm exaggerating, but an electron is changed in a, you know, in a DNA sequence, you know, methylation of like one allele. Maybe that's the risk. They're looking for the most minute changes that they think they see between Black and white people to try to explain vulnerability. When mammoth, you know, mammoth triggers like environmental racism are going right, you know, right over their heads. We're so trained to focus on biological dimorphism that we will grasp at any small genetic straw to try to explain disease, even though the mammoth differences in vulnerabilities, life experiences, diet, you know, exposures are a much more logical place to begin looking, but we don't begin looking there. So we have inherited a lot of the mythologies that sound laughable, but if we look carefully enough, we see that we still are practicing them. And that's something that has to stop. We have to change the way we react to evaluating disease. And I'm happy to say that just last week, I had no time to read the paper carefully, but just last week, the University of Pennsylvania announced they're going to stop using race as a descriptor in medical journals. I mean, how often you read a medical journal, they'll begin describing index patient, oh, a well-nourished 47-year-old Black male. Why is the fact that he's Black pertinent, you know? So they've decided to stop doing that. Finally, I mean, that's real progress.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then sort of along those same lines, this is sort of a part two to my question, if you will.
Yeah.
I'm
It's a great
curious
question.
to know, I'm curious to know, you know, uh, this is a topic that is forever like in the mainstream media right now. It's an important topic, and thinking about the lack of biologic significance with race, and thinking about its application in health, in research, and all the research that influences all the evidence-based practice that we do. It influences our diagnostic algorithms. It influences our diagnostic tools. How do you see race as a category being used in the future of medical sciences research? Like, where do you think its role will be positioned if once we start sort of moving away from the inappropriate use of race and start moving toward a more applicable use? How do you envision that?
The question is there an appropriate use of race? Maybe someone can convince me that there is, but in medicine, I don't think there is. Now in sociology, I can see it because what happens, of course, is people's health status tends to mirror the race that they're perceived as belonging to. But that has to do with their treatment by the healthcare system. A lot of racial differences are created by the healthcare system. They don't exist independent of it. So I don't think that medical care would suffer at all if we abandon completely the use of race. It's not important. What's important are disease vulnerabilities. And that's where we should be focusing. And of course, it's totally illogical. Aside from the fact these are invented categories, invented in order to perpetuate oppression, there's also the fact that in this country, most of us don't know our genealogies. You know, we don't know what kind of mating occurred in the past because of the taboo around interracial mating. We simply don't know what happened. We know some things. We know, Snippet, you may know that your grandmother was raped by the Russian man who owned her, you know, but that's only one little snapshot. You may also know that although you and your family are white, this has been a choice, an opportunity that you were able to exploit. You know, you may, maybe somebody in your family knows of the occult, racial richness in your heritage, but socially there's a taboo against speaking of it. So we simply don't know. I don't think I remember the exact data, but I actually put it in my book, A Terrible Thing to Waste. One study showed that 20%, that's 1 in 5, Africans have no genetic evidence of an African ancestry. And a good percentage of white people have unacknowledged or unknown African ancestry. That's not surprising at all to me. I'm only surprised it's not more, frankly. I think the only reason why it's not more is that because a lot more people who were able to pass for white did so because of the enormous pressures of being Black. I mean, you think it's bad now. Imagine being a Black person, during segregation or during enslavement, or when there were like a variety of, models of post-emancipation slavery, like sharecropping going on. If you looked light enough to pass for white, a lot of people would go. They wouldn't think twice, and it's certainly understandable. And they became white. So anyway, the bottom line is, I don't think there is a place for race in medicine. And I think it's a mistake for us to perpetuate that.
Thank you. I appreciate you providing that perfect clarity for everyone that's in this community space today. I want to remind everyone that you can please feel free to put any questions that you have for Harriet Washington in the chat. You can direct message either myself or Dr. Valdalama Wallace, or just share your questions. And Claire, did you have any additional questions that you wanted to ask? If not, I can continue.
So Harriet, you mentioned progress, the decision made in Pennsylvania. I wonder if you could share more examples of what institutions are doing.
Well, institutions are doing different things. Some of them work well, some of them don't, but at least they're trying, and that's important. One thing I saw some time ago, and the leadership has changed now, but I know some people still there, so I'm confident they are perpetuating these improvements. University of Chicago did some things that I thought were very important, and that must have been back in 2005. They began medical student education with an extra month of instruction that began before the formal curriculum. And they called in people like me to give lectures to the students and talk to them about either perspectives that tended to be excluded from the curriculum and their clinical experience, or in my case, history that was excluded from the canon that they were going to be taught from. I thought that was brilliant because it basically inoculated these students, with the understanding that the things that they encountered were not going to be the whole story. They were different perspectives. You can't tell students everything in a month, but you can tell them enough to know how to question things. And that's what they did. That was absolutely brilliant. And what was more brilliant to me was the fact that the chief of medicine then, his last name was Garcia, Dr. Garcia. It was clear to everyone when he was brought on board that eliminating healthcare inequities was a priority to him. He talked about it all the time. He actually evaluated people and departments on how well they did for it, which meant that it became a priority for everybody there. I think that's what you need. We need leaders for whom it is a priority, that'll make it a priority. And I've been talking more recently about the importance for institutions to integrate real accountability in their evaluations. For example, if you're evaluating medical students, decide who graduates, there's certain criteria you expect them to achieve, certain skills they have to acquire. The same with residents, the same with aspirants to faculty leadership positions. Some of those criteria should have to do with health equity, treating people of different races the same. You should devise policies and devise ways of measuring progress there and apply them, which means that if you're a medical student and there's evidence that you are not treating patients the same, you shouldn't be able to graduate or you should get lower grades. You know, if you're a resident, you shouldn't be able to finish your residency without demonstrating you can do this. If you can't do it, you stay on until you can. We need meaningful accountability, because very often when, we denude some aspect of inequity, the response is, we need more education, we need more training. That's not going to get it. We need more than that. We need there to be not only the carrot, but the stick. You know, it's like any other skill, any other criterion. You know, if a person were a medical resident and weren't able to, say, put in a central line, you wouldn't let them progress, right? You wouldn't turn them loose on patients. Don't turn people loose on patients who have shown that they cannot treat all patients the same. So I think that needs to be, those policies need to be integrated, not only institutions, but we need it on the government level as well.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, Dr. Schwartz and I working together with some amazing colleagues, including students, on the Dismantling Racism in Nursing Education Task Force. We are in these conversations and planning and thinking how bold we need to be. So I appreciate your thoughts there.
Yeah, I actually got the idea because of a nurse. What happened was, in trying to make sure that appropriate hand washing was being done by surgeons, many hospitals began telling nurses to monitor surgeons' hand washing and remind them to do appropriate hand washing. And that was not working very well. Surgeons did not really welcome that kind of scrutiny by nurses, right? But one institution got the idea of supplementing that by docking a surgeon's pay if he didn't appropriate hand washing. The nurse would report, I've talked to him several times, he's still not doing it, and his pay would be docked. They saw the improvements they wanted to see very quickly. That gave me the idea.
There have been several questions coming in the chat here. So one I want to sort of bring back to this idea. Jason Smith has written a question here saying, is the United States biomedical focus systematically racist? And can it sort of go beyond being racist and sort of do that by attending to the social determinants of health? So I guess the question here is, how do we address social determinants of health as a healthcare system and not sort of engage around race and racial categories, given that the structures are already designed to be racist? Right.
Great question. Also deceptively complex because, race should be eliminated. But we remember that race and racism are two different things. So racism is in the structure of the system. But like race, I'm not sure how useful it is to talk of racism. I'm not saying it's not accurate. It certainly is accurate. But it might be more useful if we're going to dismantle the system and come up with a better one to talk about the practices that are separating, the practice that cause the healthcare system not to treat people of color equitably. So, for example, the thing about using the word racism is it means different things to different groups of people. That's always a problem in using language. You can't have a term that has vague or malleable meaning. It's not going to work. I say racism because I'm talking about a structure or a practice separating people from good care. And the person I'm speaking to hears, she's calling me a racist. She's calling me an immoral person. You know, this is really shameful. I got to defend myself and deny it. And that's what they do. They deny that they're racist, they deny it's racist. And meanwhile, the point is not being addressed. So talking more specifically, for example, rather than racism, I would say, let's talk about the fact that in this institution, Black patients who come with complaints of pain tend to be sent away and being labeled as drug seeking. Let's talk about that. That has to end. How are we going to end that? You know, that I think that could be more fruitful. But now we're talking about things that can be quantified, that can't be denied, that everyone agrees are bad, and don't evoke people's shame. You know, I think we waste a lot of time and effort dancing around the shame of white people who feel they're being accused of racism. It's human nature. Nobody wants to be accused of being an immoral person or doing a wrong thing. But there are two things that happen as a result of these accusations, and neither of them are good. One of them is that white people feel shame, and then their human reaction is to resort to language that will distance themselves from the accusation of racism. When I hear about implicit bias, I always have like this mental addendum, yes, and explicit bias. You know, both are going on. But we're talking about implicit bias because nobody wants to be accused of explicit bias. So much better to point out the fact that explicit bias happens and we need to do something about it. So, and then the other problem with talking about racism is that we just use too much language that is meant to assuage the feelings of white people. Sorry to say it so blankly, but there it is. You know, we're so worried about white people being labeled racist or having their feelings hurt because we think that we're labeled as racist, that we formulate language to assuage that and to ally those fears and senses, but then we end up not saying directly what has to be said. I think there needs to be, among other things, a wider understanding that you don't need to have a racist animus for racism to triumph. No one has to have the opinion that Black people or brown people are inferior and it's your job to subjugate them. That's not what has to happen. All that has to happen is a system like our healthcare system that has been designed with the subjugation of Black people in mind to go along unchecked. So it's important for Black white people to understand that when we talk about racist practices in the institution, we're not saying that we think you personally are a racist. We're saying this institution has problems that need to be addressed. Making that clear, I think, might save us a lot of time and anxiety and difficulty by having to dance around language and dance around people's feelings. And frankly, I'm going to admit that sometimes I'm less than patient around the using language to try to avoid acknowledging the inevitable, because the bottom line to me comes down to what's more important. Is it more important to make sure that previously marginalized people of color have access to the same excellent care as everybody else? Or is it more important to spare the feelings of doctors and healthcare workers who feel that they're being accused of being racist? Um, I'm sure the latter is more important, frankly, to everybody. So let's focus on that.
Yes, absolutely. Ramina Gates has a question to this effect of, if we abandon race as a social category in medicine, what does that mean for public health epidemiology and tracking particular social determinants of health and disease? And I think you kind of have already hit on this a little bit, that what we're sort of looking at when we're measuring social determinants of health, when we're sort of thinking about measuring things from an epidemiologic perspective, what we're looking at isn't necessarily race, but can you sort of really address her question there?
We're looking at racism because it's how people are treated. It's true if you look at environmental racism, you're looking at harms done to Black people. Why? Black people, it is race that determines who's a victim, right? But that's a social construct. So you take Black people and you put them into areas where they're going to have greater exposure. So yes, Black people are the victims, but not because of any inherent quality of them. It's because of how they're being treated by society and by the healthcare system. So that's why I think it's more logical rather than use race as even though it is something that's predicated on race, what we're really concerned about are people exposed to environmental racism, people exposed to environmental toxicity. Then we look at those people, track them. And most of them are going to be Black and Hispanic. Some of them will be white, smaller them will be white, but they're important too. So it would take a bit of a revolution, but it's more logical to look at the actual determinants, who's actually being harmed. And it would be a sea change in the way we practice medicine. It runs very contrary to the American obsession with race, but we don't need race. You know, we need to focus on people who are being disproportionately exposed, harmed, or separated from healthcare. And if we do that, we are mostly going to be helping people of color, but also other people who need it. Very poor whites, profoundly poor whites. In Appalachia, it gets complicated because, we don't want to fall into a trap of thinking that the issues are sociological and not racial, not due to racism. They are due to racism. If you look at profoundly poor white people who earn only $10,000 a year, that's very poor. But they have less exposure to environmental toxicity than middle-class African Americans. So in that case, it is racism, but not race. That's a distinction that we have to make. Instead of race, which labels people, we look at racism, which labels the behavior of institutions. If we do that, we're going to have a more logical, focused approach on the things that are determinants of health, whether they're social or physical. But it is going to take a huge revolution in the way that we think. I mean, it's a 4th century habit we have of labeling people by race, and we're not going to shake it off overnight, but it's something that we should shake off because it's simply not logical.
With you 100%. I want to shift gears a little bit from this topic and sort of think more broadly about how these issues sort of impact systems within our educational system. There was a question posted in the chat, and it's an interesting one. It says, the marketing of Cal State East Bay revolves around the term diversity. The school prides themselves as one of the most diverse schools in California, but the numbers otherwise, especially in the health sciences and nursing, are different, show something completely different. So with regards to semantics, how is the term diversity used to cover up institutional racism? So thinking about issues around diversity within the student body, issues around diversity among the faculty, the imagery that's used to promote diversity of an institution. And a lot of things are coming to mind right now. What do you think about that?
I prefer precision in language, so I've never liked diversity. Diversity is far too vague. Are we talking about left and right-handed people? I mean, diversity, you can have an enormous degree of diversity and still end up with a room full of Black women or a room full of white men, depending on what you decide is diverse. It's simply too vague. And frankly, a lot of the elements of diversity don't have much to do with healthcare. Some of them are really important, but some of them are not in terms of healthcare. I think it's just too imprecise. There's no titration, like no gradation that shows, clear connections to healthcare. I think we're much better off looking at what the actual issues are and then determining what has to be done. For example, use the term diversity. It's very broad. You can include a lot of people. But if you're looking at an issue, say end-stage liver disease, and see who is not availing of basic resources, doesn't have access to basic technology around that. Find out who that is. And I don't know who it is today. I know that 15 years ago it was Black men, right? So then what do we want to do if we want to achieve equity? Do we want to have a diverse, approach to this issue, or do we want to have an approach that's going to target the people who are being excluded and treated differently and excluded from healthcare? I think the latter is more logical. You know, who's having a problem accessing this particular technology, say of transplantation, say. If we find that it's almost exclusively Black men, then maybe we should be embracing solutions to that instead of embracing the idea of diversity, which may not, yield many many benefits here. It might not make that much more difference. So I really prefer looking more precisely at what the issue is, and then looking at the parties who are being separated from healthcare and from that issue. I think that's makes a lot more sense to me.
As we get ready to sort of wrap things up, I want to take a minute to sort of call everyone's attention and highlight your most recently published book, Carte Blanche, The Erosion of Informed Consent in Medical Research. And I really I'm hoping that you can speak a little bit about the difference between thinking about informed consent, the difference between informed consent in our healthcare setting compared to the informed consent process that takes place within health sciences research.
Oh, that's exactly the crux of the matter. Informed consent, of course, is that very specific species of consent elicited and actually dictated by our laws. Code of Federal Regulation lays it out very well. If you want to engage in medical research, you have to tell the person all the known risks of that research, explain the benefits, explain what you're trying to do, how you propose to do it, and what lifestyle effects it might have. Will you be able to unable to drive, lose your appetite? And as the trial unfolds, you got to keep informing people of things. So if they know, for example, if you find that redheads, for example, are experiencing some kind of side effect, you've got to tell everyone in there. So it's a very precise and intense and rich form of listening consent, and it's guaranteed by our law, but there have been changes in the law since 1996, two laws in particular that say that certain types of research you don't need to give informed consent. That's what the law says, but when you read the law, what you find is that certain types of research you don't have to give any kind of consent at all. One type devolves around trauma victims. The assumption is that they're unconscious, but there's actually no route for determining they're unconscious. Assumptions they're unconscious, and they say, well, they're unconscious, they can't give consent, therefore you don't offer them any consent, you just do what you want to do. And that's been used to test artificial blood, a wide range of modalities. The other type is a waiver of consent that is used to test things that have no more than minimal risk. Again, more vague language, which I hate. You know by now, I hate vague language. Okay, minimal risk, what is that? Okay, is the risk of stubbing your toe minimal risk? Is the risk of breaking your neck a minimal risk? I mean, you're not telling us what it is. And indeed, one form of research that was green-lighted under this waiver was the ketamine studies. Remember Elijah McClain, who died after he was given ketamine in an experiment in which he did not give his consent? Many people in the study end up losing their ability to breathe, end up on a ventilator. They wake up in the hospital on a ventilator the next day. And so that's a problem. But I hear from people, I've talked to, doctors and ethicists say, listen, you don't understand. Sometimes you can't get people's consent. Sometimes we want to test a better form of emergency care, and there's no time, or the person's unconscious, and we have to do it without asking their permission. But we need to do something urgent. We can't just let them die. We have to do something. Well, the problem is what they're doing is they're conflating research and treatment. Yes, if someone seems critically ill, we do have to do something urgently, but that something is not involved in research. You give them the standard of care. You give them the best approved care that you know of. That's the only ethical way of handling it. But many researchers think that it's okay. The only reason that they can make that argument is what they're doing is they're confusing research and treatment, and they're playing off layperson's understanding that if you're treating someone, there are cases where it's appropriate to do that without getting that person's consent. If I'm if I stagger into an ED, clutching my chest, and fall over before I can ask for help, the ED doctor can reasonably assume that I want help. That's why I came to the ED, right? If I faint in the street, you can assume that I would want a passing doctor, even a layperson who knows CPR, to help me. That's different. That's not research. And it's so different because in medical treatment, you are the focus, your health, your wellness, your well-being. The physician does everything he can, pulls out the stops to take care of you. But in research, that's different. You're not the focus. I'm not saying researchers are heartless and don't care about people. They went into research because they do care about people. But you are not the focus, and your individual health and wellness is not the goal of research. The goal of research is to find something that will help a lot of people, other people, but not you. Certainly, if a researcher can help you while conducting research, they'll do that, but sometimes they can't. It's not compatible. For example, if you're in a research study, very often randomization means randomization by computer. The computer decides what treatment you get or don't get, and it doesn't take into account who you are and your own personal health status and et cetera. It just, you're a number, basically. So that's why research and treatment are very different when it comes to informed consent. And that's why, where I understand if you're being treated as a patient, there are times when you'll be treated without getting your consent. As a research subject, that's never appropriate in my view, because you are not, your wellness and your health are not the focus. You don't have the same rights as a patient. And in fact, one ghoulishly amusing thing happened in Duke University in North Carolina. They were doing a non-consensual study, and they kept advertising it as not as research, but saying, you're very lucky to live here. We've got this new cutting edge treatment. If you live here and you become a trauma victim, you're going to get it. Lucky you. Okay, it was artificial blood. But a lawyer pointed out, wait a minute, the North Carolina Patient Bill of Rights precludes research without consent. They had to stop the study because they were confusing treatment and research in that manner. It was working for them elsewhere, but it didn't work for them in North Carolina until a while later when they gave them a waiver and let them continue the study anyway. But as you can see, they're two very different situations. And it's really important to, in research, be vigilant that people, subjects are not being used in research with the false message that they are benefiting from some kind of new and unusual treatment. Jane Katz, a brilliant ethicist who died some time ago, he called that the therapeutic illusion, the illusion that you're getting treatment when you're really being used as a research subject. That was a great question.
Thank you for that. So another question from a member of our audience. Could you speak to the current status of the emergency use of Pfizer and Moderna, given the pharmaceutical history of non-consensual drug use in the US and Africa? And you speak to that in the last chapter of your book.
Yeah, actually, that question conflates a lot of things. There's a lot going on there. You've got the Pfizer and Moderna, actually Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna vaccines, I think they're referring to, right? Okay. I don't want to spend the rest of my life in court, so I have to be very careful what I say. If you want to know what I really think about this, my book, Deadly Monopolies, actually talks about Pfizer and some of the ways it's run in afoul of the law in its practices. I'm not going to do that now, but I will say that many pharmaceutical companies, not just Pfizer, have had a history of conducting research in the third world, developing world. It's very common. In fact, most research now is being conducted in the developing world because it's cheaper and can be done more quickly. And unfortunately, they often have been accused and found of not doing informed consent as a law dictates. For example, the Pfizer study of its antibiotic Trovan in Nigeria ended with the deaths of children who are also injured. Pfizer had to pay a huge settlement. No one knows exactly how much. I think 75 million is the last figure I read. A huge settlement. And they found that not only were there, quote unquote, missing informed consent forms, but the legal document that they had to file with the hospital, getting a hospital's permission to conduct the study there. Turns out it was forged after the fact. They never had the requisite permission. So, and Pfizer is not alone. Other companies cut corners in the developing world. What I find even more concerning is I have spoken to a lot of researchers, especially when I was at Harvard, and they told me quite openly, we don't offer informed consent to our subjects very often. I'm like, why ever not? Well, I love this one. Because in their culture, consent is obtained from the head man, the chief, or maybe the head of the family. They don't believe in an individual informed consent. So we go to the head man or the head of the family and get blanket consent for everybody there. I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. Aside from the fact that that's illegal, how, you think that's right? Yes, because we're being sensitive to their culture. We don't want to violate their feelings, and we are trying to promulgate their own culture. I said, oh, I see. So when you finish your testing and you have a safe, effective drug, you offer it for free to everybody there, right? Like, no, we can't afford to do that. We can't afford to medicate the whole developing world. I said, but if you only care about their feelings and their culture, surely they want this great drug that's safe and effective. You should be giving it to them. Maybe, respect for their culture is not what's really motivating you. Maybe it's convenience. Maybe it's a lot easier and cheaper to do research without getting permission. Maybe it's I didn't make many friends in this program saying things like that, but it's true. So a lot of can't is used. And we can't forget the fact that even in the US, the last thing I'm going to say about this is that the US has got its own shameful history. How many of you heard about the CIA's polio vaccine study in Pakistan? The CIA mounted a fake polio vaccination program. They were only given one shot of a required 2-dose polio vaccination, and they were doing it in reality to take blood samples. They were looking for relatives of Osama bin Laden. They were still looking for him. And they found relatives, and by finding their relatives, they were able to find Osama bin Laden. The minute they found him, they abandoned this fake vaccination campaign. Nobody was immunized during the course of it. And when the people who lived there found out this had been a CIA program and not a real vaccination study, horrible cascade of things happened. First of all, countries that had only recently begun to allow vaccinators into their country began banning them. And then 7 people giving polio vaccinations were murdered by people who thought they might be CIA operatives. And the thing was that in the past, South Africa had also had a plan for administering contraceptives to Black people under the guise of vaccinations. So the CIA helped to like a resurgence of people's fears, justified fears around vaccination. But what I was really struck by was that when you read the paper of record here in the country, you read the news media, all you read about was how people feared polio vaccinations. And when the 7 vaccinators were killed, there was no context there very often. They wrote it as if, oh, people in these countries, they fear Western medicine so much they're killing people who are trying to vaccinate them. Well, yes, but we only have ourselves to blame for that. So these kind of things happen. And, the deception practiced on people in the developing world and in this country is, a really effective way of fomenting distrust. So when people, wax sentimental about distrust, they need to understand that we have a role in that too. And it's really important to, monitor our own behavior and to cease, lying to people in research studies. Because it may be happening in Pakistan and Nigeria, but word gets back to this country and people of color hear about it in this country. And they quite logically assume if our government and our companies are willing to do that to Black people abroad, why wouldn't they do that to me? So it's not really an irrational fear.
Thank you for that.
Thank you so much for just elucidating all of that. I'm still like trying to just process everything I just heard. Thank you.
Oh, sure.
We are sort of nearing the end. I just want to be mindful of the time here. I know that all of us are just sort of hanging on to every word that you have and just, hunger for more. But I thought that we would maybe just close with one last question for you.
Sure.
And Claire, perhaps, you maybe want to ask that one additional question that you had that I just think that would be really great to close with, just to learn a little bit more about Harriet.
Is this the one about the books?
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Alicia. So I know I'm not the only one, but I just ordered your latest book and I so look forward to reading it. But I think it'd be great for us to hear, you mentioned, Dr. Dorothy Roberts' work, and I wonder, who else are you reading? Who else are you following? Who should we also consider following if we aren't already?
Ruha Benjamin is doing really great work around technology and race. Of course, I immediately blanked on the exact title of her books. Race After Technology. She looks at algorithms and how many algorithms, they look very logical. The intent, I'm sure, is positive, but in reality, they incorporate a lot of bias, and there are lots of consistent biases that just help to perpetuate the separation of Black people from appropriate medical technology and medical care, as well as biases and stereotypes about Black people. One of the really common ones, Ruha Benjamin doesn't talk about this exclusively, but many people have written about this. One of the really common ones that you see is the consistent confusion of physiology and biology. Very often when looking through the lens of race, people find a physical distinction, they leapfrog to the idea that it's a racial, genetic distinction. It may or may not be genetic. In fact, it may or may not exist, but if it exists, it might be a physical distinction for some other reason. And yet genetics sort of becomes a default, which is very illogical, but also a very powerful way of promoting mythologies about genetics and race and the putative connection between the two, which is non-existent, but is still flogged unmercifully. But Ruha Benjamin's work is really innovative and really brilliant. And beside her and Dorothy Roberts, the other person whose work is wonderful is Patricia Williams. The Alchemy. Yeah, you know the work. Yeah. So, oh, and one more, also brilliant, Jonathan Kahn, Race in a Bottle, published within the last couple of years. He is the person who first wrote about Bidil, the first drug to be approved by the FDA for African Americans only. And it was promulgated as like the classic triumph of personalized medicine, genetic medicine, basically. A medicine that was genetic engineered for African Americans only. But it turns out to be complete fiction, and he does an excellent job of analyzing not only the errors and the frank fraud, but also the social consequences that underlie it. So that's a wonderful book, Race in a Bottle. And there's more, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. Let's all just go to Marcus Books and order these books if we don't already have them.
I love Marcus Books.
That wraps it up. As Dr. Schwartz said, I think we could be here with you for so long. So I'm going to actually pass it back. I'll pass it back to Jess and Liam.
Wish we all had the time, but thank you for all the great questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Harriet, for spending the afternoon with us. I know I learned a lot, and I know that all of our participants were really engaged and chatting and taking notes. So we really appreciate you being in community with us today and bringing to light some of these issues that some of us might have not known about before. So we thank you for your time and all that you have done. Thank you, Alicia, and thank you, Claire, for moderating the panel, or not the panel, the discussion.
Mhm.
And at this point, we will stop the program unless anyone has anything they need to ask me directly. Just a reminder, if you're interested in attending another keynote like this, we have Scott Turner Schofield, who will be here on Thursday, April 8th in honor of LGBTQ+ month. So go to the DISC webpage to register for that. And then also please keep an eye out on your inbox. We're going to be sending out evaluations post the event. So we would really appreciate if you would mind filling that out so we can collect some data. And just want to thank you all for being here. Wish you the best for the rest of your day and hope you have a wonderful weekend ahead. Thank you again, Harriet.
Pleasure was